Hello, and welcome to this first in a series of talks about the pragmatic approach. My name is Bill Andrews. The title of this talk is Understanding How Needs and Resources Helps to Offer a Roadmap for Health and Well-Being. And my contact information is there, bill.andrews@pragmatictracker.com, and my mobile is 07980 260 857. Okay, so let's get started. Well, you'll notice on our website and on cards, etc., we have this logo here. And perhaps as we've worked our way down through this talk, we'll come back to this logo again and revisit where the ideas contained within it come from. But for now, what I want to do is think about defining some terminologies, some things that we're discussing here, and unpacking them so that we get some good, solid understanding of what we're talking about. See, it's very easy to talk in what some would call nominalizations. So these are words that don't have any real intrinsic meaning, and they mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And Joe Griffin, one of our trainers, used to say, you should be able to put the thing into a wheelbarrow to wheel it away so you can see it and really get a sense of what it's about. So I want to look at some terms now and see if we can put them into that wheelbarrow. Well, mental health, mind, and well-being, these are all terms that we sort of have a sense of what they mean, but then when we're actually pursue it, it's quite hard to actually pin down exactly what we're talking about. And again, different people may have different interpretations. So let's have a go then at defining what mental health actually means. Well, in a way, this is a little bit like trying to understand the universe. And I don't know if you've been seeing any of the Brian Cox programs on television recently, but as one tries to fathom this expanding universe that seems to go on and on for infinity, and that there are billions of universes beyond our universe, well, it all gets a bit unfathomable. And I guess this is in some way what it's like trying to define what mental health is. Now, of course, when we talk about mental health, that sort of suggests that there's another sort of health, which of course we commonly term physical health. And it's like the idea that, well, if you join the mental health with the physical health, well, then you'll get what I suppose we might call is health. Well, in a way, this is a sort of an artificial division, isn't it, between mental health on the one hand and physical health on the other hand. And of course, these two are intimately intertwined with each other to give us what we just know as health, really. But I suppose, like in every other situation, we tend to turn to the experts to try to get some accurate definitions. And who else should we turn to except the World Health Organization? After all, that's what they're there for. So they're defining mental health in this updated definition from August 2014, so very recent, as a state of well-being. And as you can see here, they say mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. The positive dimension of mental health is stressed in WHO's definition of health as contained in its constitution. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. Well, for me, you know what? That still doesn't give me something to hang my hat on. I'm still not really sure what that means. It sounds pretty good, but I want to sort of touch it and feel it and really get a sense of what it's about. So I'm afraid I'm still not happy that we've got this inside our wheelbarrow just yet. In fact, it sort of makes me feel even a bit more frustrated because there's all this language used, but I'm just thinking, yeah, but what is that exactly? Now, if we'll go back and look at a bit more close proximity of what's written here, what we do see is health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, whatever that is. But then it says, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, absence of disease or infirmity. Now, that's something we can really get in the wheelbarrow, because this is an easy one to unpack, this idea of disease and infirmity. Now we're away to the races. After all, think of all those terms that we're so familiar with: depression, anxiety, post traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, dysfunction, psychosis, schizophrenia, ADHD, BPD, and there's hundreds and hundreds more. It's really easy to nail down what mental distress is like, okay. And in fact, we have a Bible for it: the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, first published in 1952 and now in the 5th edition published in 2013. You know what? Before 2013, we only had 297 mental disorders. And guess what? Over the last few years, 14 years in fact, pretty much one a year and one extra, we discovered another 15. So now we have 312 mental disorders. Oh my God, this is not helping me to get a handle on what mental health is all about. It certainly tells me a lot about what an absence of mental health is about, okay. But that doesn't really give me something to get a grip of what mental health really means. Okay, so who's going to help? Well, of course, there's counselors and psychotherapists. Surely they will be able to explain all this in simple terms to me. But then, if I'm an unsuspecting member of the public and I'm wondering, who am I going to see? Well, we could look up Yellow Pages, we can look up Wikipedia for a list of all the different types of psychotherapies out there to help us make a decision about who's likely to give us confidence that they know what mental health is all about and guide us towards that holy grail. Well, in Wikipedia, you can look for yourself and you will see that there are lots and lots of different schools. Here on this slide, we're looking at the ones that come under A and B and all the way through to T and V. And hey, there's only 2 letters of the alphabet that don't have any ranking. And I really find the final ones pretty interesting. V for vegetotherapy, W for wilderness therapy. Give me a break. You know what? At last count, there were well over 500 schools of counselling and psychotherapy, and there's in excess of 11,000 books on the subject of alleviating mental distress. You know what? If a field needs to have so many different manifestations of itself and it needs to write that amount of text, the chances are it's not quite clear of its direction of travel. So I'm back to help again, I'm afraid. Hold on a minute, there must be somebody else who can help. Well, of course there is. There's the government, isn't there? So in 2011, we have a new report from the government: No Health Without Mental Health. Cross-government mental health outcome strategy for people of all ages. Surely this will have within it the jewels we're looking for. So published in 2011. Now, even more recently, at the recent party conference, Nick Clegg promised that should they get re-elected, no doubt as part of the coalition, that he would seek to shorten the waiting time for the treatment of mental illness by the NHS. And of course, we know how Nick Clegg keeps his promises, don't we? But hang a minute, what about going back to the last lot? Do you remember these fellas? They were around for a long time, weren't they? Back in 2005, this photograph was taken running up to that election, Tony Blair's 3rd election victory. Now, there was a chap back then called Lord Layard, Richard Layard. And Richard Layard made a strong argument to Gordy over there to say, look, we can help save the Exchequer some money here, because we know that most attendances at the GP, most time off work, In fact, a good 50% of it is definitely related to mental distress. And he made a strong argument, which was then brought into place with Patricia Hewitt, the then Secretary of State for Health, and the plan went ahead so that Richard Layard persuaded the government to make a massive investment in improving access to psychological therapies delivery beginning way back in 2005. And the plan was to train literally tens of thousands of new therapists, not about those people who were already out there who were doing good work as counselors in all sorts of situations, including GP practices up and down the country. Those people had to now retrain, lose their jobs and retrain for the main, and return to be trained in these new evidence-based practices that would be delivered across the nation to reduce mental distress and get people back to work. And of course, by getting people back to work, this was going to save the exchequer a fortune. And it represented the biggest single investment in mental health treatment ever made in Britain. And you know what? It brings smiles to my face as I think about these trained new therapists marching out, starting from Whitehall in London, marching out across the land to deliver these evidence-based practices and returning people in their millions back to work again and saving the country a fortune. Little was it to be predicted, of course, that 2005 was the beginning of the end of the great times, and by 2008 factors would be contributing to massive rise in unemployment and the period of austerity that we've entered since then, which no amount of IAPT treatment was going to counteract the flow of. So we're back to that wheelbarrow again, and we're not going very far here. We've still got a lot of questions to ask. Well, time to chill the beans here now and kick back a little bit, and let's have a look at some different ideas, because often when things aren't coming clear and looking in one direction, maybe it's time to just sit back and see if there's an alternative model that we could approach something from. So let's go back to basics. Let's just think, for example, of something like a single-celled amoeba, or a jellyfish, or a plant, or indeed our human's best friend, the dog, or us humans. In fact, any sort of life form at all. Now, I think that we could probably get agreement from everybody listening to this, everybody in any room I'm speaking of, or any scientist anywhere across the world, or indeed anyone at all, that in order to thrive, any living organism needs to live in a healthy, pollution-free environment. I think we could probably all agree on that. And that there must be an interaction with that environment through some sort of nutrient exchange. So if you think, for example, of a plant in the garden and it's imbibing nutrients through the soil and it's exchanging with the sun through photosynthesis, it's transferring nutrients out as well. You've got that exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen going on there. And so there's an exchange taking place with that environment. And of course, for that plant or the dog or the single-celled amoeba or the jellyfish or any other life form at all, it must contain within it some mechanisms that allow it to interact, to have that interaction actually take place. I think we could all agree on that. So let's think of this now in terms of human needs and human interaction with the environment and how that might take place. Well, there's a long history in psychology of the investigation of needs. You may have heard of a chap called Abraham Maslow who talked about a hierarchy of needs. And then there was a psychiatrist who became well known back in the 60s, William Glasser, and he talked about the need for power, love, freedom and fun. Then somebody in the late 70s, Stephen Covey, popularized the idea of simple needs being attention, appreciation, and affection. And then the people who I trained with, Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell, talked about needs in terms of our human givens, that which we get as virtue of our birthright, our givens of human nature. And then Dan Siegel in his interpersonal neurobiology. All of these people talk about human needs. But let's just look a little bit more closely at what some of these needs might generally, that we could all probably agree on, we all certainly have. Well, there's the need for control and autonomy. There's a need to feel secure and safe within ourselves. There's a need for connection and indeed intimacy if we could get it, which is very desirable. And then, of course, we have the need for meaning. And we can meet that need for meaning through being needed ourselves and being stretched and learning new things and having some model about something greater than ourselves that goes beyond us, whether it's politics or religion or philosophy or just some sense of being a part of something bigger than just us single individuals. We've a need for a sense of achievement, to feel we're learning and we're growing and developing. And of course, we have a need to feel valued and respected. And that gives us, in turn, a sense of our own personal status and self-esteem. We also have a need for giving and receiving attention. And of course, a lot of these things are intertwined. But these are what I think we could all pretty well agree are basic fundamental needs. We may feel that some are a bit more important than others, but we could find that the absence of these will tend to lead to problems for us. Now, of course, we must have mechanisms within us, mustn't we, that allow us to get those needs met. So let's have a think about that. Well, these human resources then would be a mixture of the resources we're actually born with by virtue of the fact of being human, those human givens, and of course there are those resources that we develop throughout our lifespan. So if we think about our genetic resources, then we have resources such as pattern matching, which we'll say more about in a minute. We've got the amazing resource of having an imagination. Another amazing resource is the fact that we can remember things. I know some of us might say, well, that's getting a bit more challenging these days, but the truth is we are able to remember, and our ability to lay down memory in all sorts of different forms is actually incredibly important for us as human beings. We have an ability to build rapport so we can attune with other people, connect up with other people. And we have the capacity to stand back and observe ourselves. We can even observe ourselves observing ourselves, which is something quite amazing. Now, we also have the ability to regulate our emotions. Might be challenging sometimes, but it's an important ability that we have. And in fact, a very important part of that is our ability to go into and out of different trance states as we need to do that. And we possess a dreaming brain. Now think about it. A dreaming brain is such a phenomenal thing to have. After all, it's like going to the cinema or the theatre every night. We go to sleep. Now, of course, you'll say to me, but I never remember my dreams. Well, our dreams are designed in such a way as to be forgotten because of the purpose that the dreaming brain serves for us, which we'll learn more about in future talks as well. What about our learned resources then? Well, everything we learn comes from interactions with our environment. As we go on through our life, we're out there in the world, we're learning all of the time, and that becomes then part of our resource of our bed of knowledge as we go through our lives. And of course, we develop skills, we have training, we have lots of experiences, and all of this becomes part of the learned resources for us. Now, I said I wanted to return to this idea of pattern matching because it's so important to get a handle on what pattern matching is. And I think there's two nice ways to really get a sense of what pattern matching is about. Basically, pattern matching allows us to connect up what's inside of us with what's outside of us. So we have a newborn baby, and how does a newborn baby know to smile at its primary caregiver, and how does it know how to suck and what to suck on? Well, it can only know that if it has patterns inside of it already through its genetic inheritance that gives it a template for matching up with something it's expecting to see out in the outside environment. Because after all, a baby's never seen that primary caregiver's face before, and a baby has never sucked on a mother's breast before or on the teat of a nipple on the bottle that's resembling the mother's breast. So how does it know what to do? How does it instinctively know what to do? Well, it instinctively knows what to do because it's connecting up a pattern that's inside of it with something that is outside of it. And this is a fundamentally important thing. Another example of this is the way that we can learn languages. One time, many years ago, I lived in Mallorca, and I was fascinated to see that young kids could seamlessly move between the local Mallorquin language, Catalan, Castellano, German, and English. And it was amazing that the capacity was there. It was such a flexible, adaptive system, so that contained within inside the young mind was the ability to adapt to whatever language it was learning out in the environment and just absorb it and take it on board. And of course, what's also interesting is that as time goes by the time we reach 11 or 12 years of age, typically we're established in our particular environment, we're used to that particular language, and so it's much, much harder for us to engage in language learning as we get older. It's far, far easier to do that as we're literally learning to speak in the first place. And in fact, this pattern matching then forms the basis of all learning. And I would like to perhaps controversially suggest that it forms in fact the basis of much of psychological distress as well. Well, what happens when it all goes so horribly wrong? Well, when we become emotionally aroused, we lose the ability to regulate our emotions. Now, some degree of emotional arousal, of course, is very important for engagement and learning, and it in fact sharpens our intellect and our ability to absorb information. But excess of emotional arousal actually shuts down our ability to engage. It collapses our ability to use those higher centers of our brain that really make us to be the humans that we are. And in fact, and no doubt we've all witnessed this, we recede through millions of years of evolution to far more primitive states. All we have to do is watch TV from any of our inner cities on a Friday night and see the effects of alcohol to see how many of us humans recede through millions of years of evolution to far more primitive states. Now, a very good way of getting a handle on what this is all about is with something that's a favorite of mine. It's called the handheld model of the brain. And this is beautifully described by eminent psychiatrist Dan Siegel. And if you simply Google Dan Siegel handheld model of the brain, you'll find a really nice, lots of different YouTube clips with him explaining a lot about this. Okay, so we're now beginning to get things unpacked a little bit about what are those ingredients that may promote mental well-being. But what about mind? What about understanding exactly what mind is? I mean, we use mind a lot. I mean, mind yourself. Oh, it was mindless the way that person behaved. Mindfulness. This is creeping in a lot now into modern psychology, albeit for the fact that the Buddhists were talking about mindfulness nearly 6,000 years ago. Well, Dan Siegel, I return to again for a working definition of mind, because back in the 1990s he gathered together 40 eminent scientists to see if he could keep them together for a week so they could come up with a definition of mind. And at the end of the day, nobody was really willing to commit to what they would describe as a fixed definition of mind, because they see it as a flowing process. So he could get agreement, though, with them on what he describes as a working definition of mind. And I'd like to share that with you now. So, mind is a process. And by the way, check this out within yourself. Just because Dan Siegel came to this conclusion with 40 scientists, or because Bill Andrews suggests something about it to you, doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's a question of you posing it as a challenge to yourself to consider the impact of thinking about things in this sort of a way. So mind is a process. It's a process that regulates the flow of energy and information. It is embodied. That is, it's within our bodies, including the brain, and it's relational. It's outside of our bodies, occurring between us and others outside of us. So putting all this together then, we get the mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Oh, okay. Well, that was easy. So what does that mean about what the brain is then? So Dan Siegel again has for us that the brain is the mechanism that facilitates the flow of energy information, both within us and without us, outside of us, if you like. Another way of thinking about this is the mind is the journey, the brain is the vehicle, the car, the bicycle, the shoes that we walk in to make that journey. The mind is the TV signals coming across the skies, the ether. The brain is the TV. The mind is the internet. The brain is the computer that allows us to communicate the internet, across the internet. The mind is process. The brain is mechanism. Now, when we think about brain, of course, we typically think about that's what's there inside our skulls. But, of course, the brain has all of those nerves coming down through the brainstem, going to every last square inch of our bodies, right to the tips of our fingers and our toes. And of course, we have this vast system of communications with neurochemicals, hormones, enzymes, etc. So really, if you think of the entirety of the network of communication within our bodies, that is a better way to think about what our brain actually is. And we know this in our language. We talk about having a gut feeling. Well, that gut feeling is indeed in our gut, and it's communicating from the gut right up there, up to inside our skulls, and back down again. So the relationship between the mind and the brain then, the mind uses the brain to create itself. So what a thing that is, to think that we have a process that we can engage in that actually can alter our brains. Now, if you've done any relaxation work, that is where you're choosing to put your focus of attention to engage in a process of relaxation. And thus you're engaging your brain to participate, to then send signals down to change your rate of respiration, change how you're sitting, how you're holding your body, what you're doing with your eyes, with your muscles, and all of the rest of it. That command center from the mind is using the brain to create itself. And the activities of the mind can be directed to alter the brain, just as I've explained. But our brains are social as well, because of course all of our social interactions also impact upon our mind. And our social interactions can alter our brains. Think about that. Now we know about this because, of course, these days we can investigate these things far more than we were able to do before, because since we've had the advent of new scientific techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging and scanning and all this sort of stuff. So we're able to learn more about how the impact of social interactions can actually alter our brains. So, are we getting there, I wonder, with unpacking these terms now and getting a sense of what mind, brain, mental health is all about? So perhaps we're coming closer to what might be working definitions of what mental health actually means. And so for me, putting it fairly simply, mental health is a state of emotional and social mental health is a state of emotional and social well-being where individuals, groups, and organizations can flourish and thrive. Or another way of putting that is mental health is a state enjoyed when emotional needs are substantially well met. And my friend Dan Siegel, as he would say himself, that the river of well-being flows between the banks of rigidity and chaos. And you can take all of those 300 plus disorders that make up the DSM-5, and in one form or another, they are either associated with that bank of rigidity or the bank of chaos. And it's an easier way to think about rather than getting lost in 300 different disorders. Now, of course, a reasonable starting point then, if we can agree that having our needs reasonably well met in our lives is central to our enjoyment of mental health and mental well-being, then a sensible place to start then is to see if we can measure it. And so a lot of the work I've been involved in over the last now nearly a decade has been to move away from the idea of identifying distress, dysfunction, disorder, disease, and think about, well, does mental health leave markers, and can we actually measure? And of course, what we find is that when we correlate the measurement of mental health markers around needs, human needs, with those markers that have been typically used to define conditions such as anxiety and depression, we find a direct correlation such that the absence of needs, or the failure of needs to be well met, leads indeed to be strongly associated with mental distress, as represented through the common bread and butter of mental distress, which is anxiety and depression. And so we've been working on developing a measure to help us and assist us in understanding more about that. Because after all, if mental health can be seen as humans' ability to have their needs well met, well then the identification of unmet needs and working on that is going to be helpful to restoration of our mental health again. So returning now to that logo of pragmatic approach, let's just unpack that a little bit for you. So the central part is about the individual, and within that individual are those three processes intertwined and flowing in and out of each other of mind, brain, and relationships. And of course, we might have heard of the biopsychosocial model. And if you imagine all of this swirling around, interconnecting, this gives a sense of what's just going on within us as individuals. But of course, us individuals also live in a context, a local context. That might be the local context of our relationship with our intimate other. It might be the local context of our family or our friendship network, our local community, or even our local county or country. But of course, we also live within a wider context, don't we? And that wider context might be the bigger world we live in, the bigger political situation that we live in, that bigger beyond us as little individuals. And so these are the elements that make up our logo, our pragmatic logo in the pragmatic approach. Now, of course, one can only cover so much in one talk. And while there may be lofty ambitions to cover a lot more, time is always a limiting factor. But in future talks, we will discuss the APET model and RIGAR. And the APET model helps us to understand a lot about how internal and external triggers relate to emotions and thoughts and behavior, and how indeed they can drive those behaviors. And the RIGAR model, misspelt here, is for rapport building, information gathering, goal setting, agreeing strategies, accessing resources, and rehearsing success. And this becomes a really excellent pragmatic model of working interactively with oneself, with an other, within any sort of group or organization, business, etc. And we'll talk about that a lot more in future conversations. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation, and I hope now you feel you've got something inside your wheelbarrow that you can wheel away and at least challenge yourself to investigate a little bit more about what this business of mind, mental health, and well-being is all about. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and come back soon.